Sister Ellen Francis is also an Episcopal priest and has lived extensively overseas, particularly in the Middle East, in Iran, Afghanistan, and Iraq, and has committed herself to the gift of community and brings with her today great insights into the gift, complexity, and work of community. A couple of housekeeping notes for us all. Remember that we make good use of the chat feature in our Zoom session. So if you have a question or if you have a thought that you'd like to share or just an idea that captivates you that you want to hold in front of us all, please send it out in the chat and I will do my best to draw our collective attention to it or raise the question at an appropriate time. We'll be recording this initial portion of the conversation in order that those who will be joining us in a couple of days through YouTube will have the chance to see and hear this conversation. But the personal reflections at the end, we will allow to be just natural within this environment and not recorded, therefore. Also, that reminds me of the structure. We'll be fortunate to begin this morning with Ellen Francis and then move to a conversation between the two of us. And then finally to be welcomed and incorporate a few responders from within our midst. We've got Wendy Richards this morning as one of our responders, and I believe Becca Anderson will be with us in just a moment or two as well. So thank you both for joining us as responders to this morning's conversation. And then at the end, friends, if you would like to join me for a cup of coffee, so to speak, and reflect a little more personally and a little more intently, I look forward to that opportunity at the end of our conversation this morning. But again, friends, we're fortunate to be joined again by Sister Ellen Francis and to explore the movement from apathy and fear to perseverance and courage. With that, friends, let's open with a prayer, if you will. The Lord be with you.
Also with you.
And let us pray. O God, you made us in your own image and redeemed us through Jesus, your Son. Look with compassion on the whole human family. Take away the arrogance and hatred which infect our hearts. Break down the walls that separate us. Unite us in bonds of love and work through our struggle and confusion to accomplish your purposes on earth. That in your good time, all nations and races may serve you in harmony around your heavenly throne. Through Jesus Christ, our Lord. Amen.
Amen.
Ellen Francis, it is a delight to have you with us. I'm immensely grateful that you've carved out this time for us here at Christ Church, and looking forward to hearing your insights on this important subject. We have been about a sacred conversation now for several months and excited to continue that conversation with you. So I'm going to turn the camera over to you, so to speak,
okay.
And the mic, and let you take it away.
Okay. Well, I am also really delighted to be here and very much looking forward to our conversation and your insights, your feedback on what I'm going to say. I understand that some of you or many of you have done the Sacred Ground curriculum. Am I right about that?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, quite a few. Some, maybe. Sorry, were you going?
No, I was just saying some have done,
okay.
Yes.
And I think all of you know about it. It's a curriculum developed by the Episcopal Church to explore differences across race and culture and other areas. Some of my sisters and I did it here at the Order of Saint Helena, and we found it to be an excellent program that was very comprehensive. It gave us good history that many of us did not know and good conversation and reflection. However, about halfway through the program, I decided I had a bone to pick with those who put it together because there was a group that was left out. And someday I'd like to talk to those who put it together and try to see if I could find out why, whether it was just an omission or if there was some other reason. But the Middle Eastern people were left out of that curriculum. And I think that raises the question whether Middle Eastern people are white, or are they people of color, or are they something else? So I did a little research on this, and in the early 1900s, there were immigrants from Syria and Lebanon who were considered Asian. And usually from geopolitical point of view, Asia starts with Afghanistan and India and Pakistan, goes east. And from Iran, Iraq, and so forth, going west is considered the Middle East. However, these, at first they were considered Asian, and they wanted to be considered white so that they could qualify for citizenship. By the late 1970s, the Office of Management and Budget listed all Middle Eastern people as white. On the census today, Middle Eastern people need to choose either white, or they can check the box that says other, and there is a blank that they could fill in that they are Arab, or they're from Syria, or the country, or fill in something. Some Middle Eastern people have lobbied for decades for a separate category, something like Middle East and North African. In my experience in general, older Middle Eastern people want to fit in and want to be considered white. Some younger people want to be considered people of color, for example, so that they can qualify for scholarships, minority scholarships. I was on a Zoom call recently with some interfaith friends, and we got to the question of whether Middle Eastern people were people of color. So there was one of my friends is from Turkey, and two of them were from Egypt. So we said, are you people of color? And we know each other really well. So we started going back and forth about this. And they said, I don't know, what do you think? Are we people of color? And then one of them said, people call me Olive, and I don't know what does that mean to be Olive? So they really weren't sure which they were. However, in this country, people from the Middle East have experienced a great deal of discrimination, especially since 9/11, but even before that, with the travel ban, the profiling, job discrimination, housing discrimination, and even violence against women who wear the hijab, or the Sikh men who wear a turban may be attacked because people think they're Muslim. I think it's particularly difficult for Iranians. It's almost like a triple problem because they are Middle Eastern. Many Iranians, most Iranians are Muslim, although not all. And because of all the political differences between the US and Iran in recent decades, that makes it especially difficult for people from Iran. So I'm going to tell you my story today, and we'll move through that and then talk about some of the issues related to all of this. So I grew up in New York City, and I had the perception that I was growing up in a very diverse and culturally, ethnically, religious, diverse place of my home. But that was really an illusion, because I realized now that I was living in very much in a white bubble, white middle class bubble. My church had very, very few people of color. School, summer camp, our friends, even when I went to college, I really knew very, very few people of color. Right after college, I married an Iranian and we went to live in Iran. And after growing up an only child, I was all of a sudden in this huge extended family, absolutely enormous, enormous family. I remember one day I sat down with my sister-in-law and said, okay, I really want to understand who's related to whom and how. And we had to spread out 3 or 4 8.5 by 11 pieces of paper and tape them together. And we were only covering 3 generations. So we weren't going, way back genealogy. We were just, say this is the cousin and these are 3, and this. It was really, really quite amazing. And I remember once during the summer, people used to come from the south and come to Tehran. And so we would have this huge number of family members living all together in the house all summer. And then in the winter, they would go back to the south. And one day there were maybe 10 of us sitting down for lunch. And my mother-in-law said, gee, it feels like there's nobody home because there are only 10 of us here at lunch. So it was absolutely wonderful to move into this big family. And they were, well, Iranians in general are extraordinarily hospitable. If you meet an Iranian on the street, in about 5 minutes, they'll invite you home for dinner. I was especially close to my mother and father-in-law, and I knew a number of other foreign wives of Iranians, and they didn't all have that same experience, but I was extremely close to them and was well received into the family. And one time my mother-in-law said to me that I was exactly the same to her as her oldest daughter. In recent years, I came back to the United States in 1978. I went over in 68 and came back in 1978. I've made 4 visits to Iran in recent years, and most recently in 2008. And I was able to see my mother and father-in-law again. It was absolutely wonderful to reconnect with them. And my brothers and sisters-in-law now have children, so I was able to meet my nieces and nephews-in-law. My mother-in-law had early dementia, and she was confusing family members and not really remembering a lot of things, but she remembered me. And she remembered a time when I realized that she would be cooking lunch for the family, and she would be spending all the time cooking and serving and not eat herself until after everybody else had finished eating. So we all sat down for the big Friday dinner, and I said, I'm not going to eat until Nana comes and sits down with us. And so there was a lot of fuss, and she took off her apron and she came out and she did sit down with us. 40 years later, she remembered that this had happened. So I came back from Iran in 1978, and I would say that the adjustment coming back to the States was even more difficult than the adjustment going over there. It may be because I didn't expect to have culture shock coming back, to my own country, to the country of birth. After we came back and my son was in elementary school, they had a parents' day at the elementary school. And I was really surprised when they were putting on a little program that the children were singing, "We Shall Overcome." And when I had left the States 10 years earlier, that was a protest song. We would sing that, and we were protesting, the Vietnam War. And now all of a sudden that song, to me it was sudden, that song was now sort of gentrified. And I really wondered, how much do these children really understand what that song meant? What teaching went along with that? several months later, in early, it was actually in November of '79 that the Iran hostage crisis happened. And that was, by that time, the Iranian Revolution was well underway. And the children in my son's class knew that he had come from Iran. And he was taunted, and, the kids jumped him in the playground, let's get the Iranian kid. And so I wondered how, they would go from singing "We Shall Overcome" to attacking a child in the class. I called the principal, my son came home and told me this story. So I called the principal, and he had a talk with the students, with the children, and nothing else ever happened. I don't know what he said, but something happening at about, I think my son would have been about 10 years old at the time. And it's a very tender time when children really want to fit in and don't want to be the one that's different. And that has been, and still is, a very difficult memory for him. He has grown up in this country, mostly concealing his Iranian background. He doesn't, unless he is really sure that he can tell somebody. Most of his friends don't know, many of his friends don't know. He has lived in areas in the US where it would have been quite dangerous for him for everyone, for his neighbors to know that he was from Iran. For a while, he lived in San Francisco, and that was a completely different story. He was working in an office, and one day they went around the room and said, well, I'm from Fiji, and my mother's from Japan, and I'm from, people had different backgrounds. And then they all looked at Fred, my son, and they said, you have some flavor in you. Where are you from? And so he told them, and their jaws dropped, but it was well received in that situation. I don't worry about him, being stopped by police. I don't worry about him day to day. But where he has had the biggest difficulty has been in going through passport control. And he has been, pulled off to another room and questioned because his passport says born in Iran. And that is always, something that will trigger. So one time we were traveling from Canada back into the US, and he said, now, Mom, when we go through passport control, don't say anything. Don't jump into this. I know how to handle this. So what we did was I went through first, and then he showed his passport, and you could just see the passport control person went, born in Iran, and started to say, okay, where are you, where are you? What work do you do? And started asking him questions. And what my son did was, first of all, he was very relaxed. He didn't seem tense, didn't seem worried about anything. And he made a point of talking a bit and making it very clear that he has an American accent, that he doesn't have any sort of a foreign accent at all. And by being just very calm and saying, well, this is the work I'm doing. I'm working with a videographer, and we're doing this and that. And you could just see the passport control person's tension just sort of slowly go down, and they just started talking back and forth, and then he stamped the passport, and that was it. So he has learned how to manage it, but he is always on guard when he goes through a passport control. Fast forward, I'm jumping now from 1978, 79 to 2000. I joined the Order of Saint Helena. And who would think that living in an extended Iranian family would be good preparation for living in a monastic community? That hardly makes sense, but it was wonderful, wonderful training. because living with a large extended family and living in monastic community, I have to be aware that any decision I make or anything that I do is going to affect other people, and to be aware of what that impact will be on the common life that we have together. Then in 2008, we decided to move all of our sisters together, and we all moved to Augusta, Georgia. Now, this New Yorker was suddenly living in the Deep South, and that was something I never expected. But if you follow Jesus Christ, you have to be ready for who knows what to happen. So I've been living in the South since 2008, and I've found wonderful ministries here, of interfaith ministries, peace ministry, and so on. After we arrived, we started to look for new properties to build a new convent, and we hired a consultant who was a man from Augusta. And one day, he made a disparaging remark about Iranians. And I went to another sister and I said, I can't, you know, I was new in the South, and I said, oh my God, I can't work with this guy. And she said, now, hold on, we'll set a time and you and he can sit down and talk with each other. So we did that. And he told his story. And he had been working in Nairobi in 1988. And within a few minutes, he barely missed being at the US Embassy when it was bombed. And the later report, you know, who actually was responsible for the bombing is not so important, but in his mind, it was Iran who had bombed the embassy. And then I told him my story. So for him, Iranians are terrorists. And for me, Iranians are family. And we managed to listen deeply to each other's story and to be respectful of each other's experience. He never made a remark about Iranians, again, at least in my hearing, and I could understand where he was coming from. It seems to me that looking forward towards beloved community involves a couple of steps, and the first step is an interior discernment. And I'm thinking not of discernment as a kind of, you know, we talk a lot about discernment of ministry or discernment of a calling as a big once in a lifetime or a few times in a life decisions. But I'm thinking of discernment as an ongoing daily spiritual practice that we can nurture and keep coming back to that practice of asking, how is God present in this moment? Who am I as a follower of Jesus Christ in this moment? What is the Holy Spirit saying right now? And I think the next step is a respectful listening to each other. As in the example of my conversation with our consultant, our life experiences were totally different, and that informed our perspectives. And once we heard each other's story, we could build a relationship based on that. I think the other thing that's really important to say is that we cannot assume that all members of a group, whether it's a religious group, national, ethnic, racial, we can't assume that they are all the same. So all Arabs don't have the same culture, don't have the same perspective, same experiences. They may not even be Muslim. They may be Christian. They could be any number of other, a number of other faith traditions. They may not have the same experiences of racism and discrimination. For example, my son's experience of being, and I think he would self-identify as American, could be quite different from those who are Iranian American, who may have come to this country as part of an Iranian American family. Their whole perspective would be quite different, and their experiences quite different. I think the age at which one experiences discriminatory events can make a huge difference. If someone comes to this country as a mature person, they may handle it quite differently than a child facing discrimination. I think when we say we want to respect the dignity of every human being, it includes letting them tell their own story, tell of their own experiences, and define their own self-identity. And I'd like to say a little bit more about monastic life. I think over the centuries, monastics have made all kinds of contributions to the life of the church and society, mostly positive. For example, monastics in the Middle Ages saved classical writings, copying, in spiritual development, liturgy, and chant, in many, many other ways. But the point is that monastic communities are not in isolation. Even the enclosed contemplative communities pray for the state of the world. I think today, the gift of monastic life is as a model of beloved community. Now, living together is very, very difficult. There was a monk who was asked, what is the best thing about religious life? And he said, oh, the best thing about religious life is my brothers. And then he said, well, what is the most difficult thing about religious life? And he said, my brothers. So it's both. The point is to say, this is not easy, but if we can make it work, it's a model of how this can be done. And one of the things that helps us is that we are vowed to this life. We make a life commitment eventually after about 5.5, 6 years. We make a vowed commitment to the life and to each other. And our vow is that we will discern and obey God through the common mind of our sisters. So it's not just one sister by herself saying, God told me that this is what we must do or what I must do. It's a discernment within the whole community. So the revelation that one person has, what their prayer tells them, we filter through the whole group. And we are all dedicated to the same purpose of making this life work, making our ministries available to the church, and living together peacefully. Now, we have a fairly diverse community. We have a sister from Ghana. We have a sister from Japan. We have currently one sister who is Native American, and I'll say something about that. I would say that she mostly identifies as white. She's 1/4 Native American, but she grew up in a white environment. We had another sister at one point who was also 1/4 Native American, who was raised by her Native American grandmother. And the Native American language was her first language. And then she learned English when she went to school. So she very much identified as Native American. We have a Spanish sister. We've had a Puerto Rican sister. We have 2 Jewish sisters. We have a sister who identifies as biracial. So we're not just all, white people from the same part of the US. Also, and this is really it's been fun for us. We have 3 new members. So we now have an age range from 28 to 90. And that can be a lot of fun because our young people are full of energy and the rest of us can hardly get out of our chairs. And we're very much enjoying the energy, enthusiasm, the technical capabilities. They're starting us on Instagram. I don't even know how to use Instagram. So many differences, and we're making it work. And it's very hard. A lot of times to say, I'm sorry. Sometimes somebody will be offended by something and will say, you know, what's the problem here? And so we have to understand and just say, I understand that this was, was offensive to you, and that's not what I meant. Please understand that I love you and I care about you, and I want you to be here and to be happy here. And I did not mean to offend you. So that's a conversation we have a lot. And I think above all, there's a process of learning to discern what do I need and what do I want. And being careful to take care of what I need, but not necessarily everything I want. Because above all, we're trying to discern for the common good, not for just, supporting one person, but looking at the good for all of us. I have also, I think, Father Drew asked me to have some final hope, some words at the end. And I can give you a teaser about that, but I have two stories and I want to be sure I have time to tell those two stories at the end. I like very much the frame that you've given for this series of moving from apathy to persistence. And I think that's an important piece of religious life, an important piece of building beloved community, is that commitment and persistence. And moving from fear to courage, I would say that the idea of the promise that we make, a baptismal promise, that we're going to respect the dignity of every human being, that is not a spectator sport. That has got to be, up close and personal. It's got to be a face-to-face, real life, real time commitment. So I think I'll stop there, but I do have more that I'm hoping I'll have time for at the very end. Two more stories.
Well, Ellen Francis, I look forward to those stories. You've successfully teased them, and I look forward to them. So many things just kind of jump out, and in your reflections on life, life in community, even in different forms of community. And that recognition is that not only must we be cautious about the stereotypes and limits we place on individuals within groups. You've made me realize that community takes different shapes and different characters as well. And so I'm just grateful for that kind of expansion and making me think a little more complexly about community itself. I was wondering, I just, what a rich experience to, from an outsider's perspective, what a rich experience to be embraced and incorporated into a family such as you were within Iran. And that such a family that really kind of radically differs from the traditional American nuclear family of four. So I just wanted to pull apart with you for a moment and wonder what that experience, as you look back on it within your life, how did that experience expand perhaps your understanding of family and of community?
Yeah, I think and I don't mean to be critical of my family of origin. They were New Englanders, and they had, my parents lived through, my mother and father were, they were born in 1908 and 09. So they were young young adults during the Great Depression. And they grew up, you know, ironing every dollar bill and being very, very, I would say very cautious with money, with friendship, and we did not have a lot of contact with, you know, cousins and aunts and uncles and all that. And so going from that environment to Iran, that anybody who happens to stop by the house and it's lunchtime, they're invited to lunch. And anybody who, you know, who shows up in the door is invited in. I think it's part of and that's throughout the Middle East, it's part of desert hospitality, that if your enemy shows up at the door of the flap of your tent, you invite them in and feed them. So if somebody comes to the house, you know, I'm almost still pathologically attached that I have to feed people if they come. So one day my father-in-law and I were the only two people at home, and some people showed up. And so he quickly called me into the back room, and there were four of us, myself, my father-in-law, and the two guests. And he had 4 oranges. And he was trying to arrange them on the plate. And he said, does it look like it's more if I make a pyramid, or does it look like more if I spread it out on the plate? The idea is that you don't just offer enough food, you offer more than enough. You've got to, you know, give out hospitality. As a way of, in self-defense, I would go to somebody's house and they would keep trying to feed you. And I learned the trick was to take something and just nibble at it and not eat all of it. And then I had an empty plate, so I would have to take more. So I would just nibble at it, and the next time something would come around, I would say, oh, you know, thank you. I still have some here. Thank you very much. It's a kind of generosity that just was so wonderful to be part of.
I am going back to my childhood as I hear your story about the oranges and hospitality. You know, in my grandmother's home and the Kalois across the street, which were a dear Hawaiian family to our family, we would keep a poi bowl, just a calabash of poi on the table, and it was ready and there and available to everyone who came, and shared by all. That sense of I might, looking back on it in really churchy language, talk about radical generosity and hospitality. But for a little boy, it was just ordinary life. And what a gift to, and how much it shaped the community or the families that were in that home. And I appreciate that remembrance. Similarly, I wonder how your experience in the Middle East, being a white woman within the Middle East, how has that experience perhaps shaped your experience even now within a covenanted community?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that. I think it was part of my transition from the U.S. and you know, making myself at home there, was going from being the majority person to being very much the minority person, in terms of language, culture, religion, race, if whatever that is. And it meant switching, really switching my understanding of what it's like to be you're the only one in the room who is not fluent in Farsi, who is not Muslim. And that was another, just to go back to the hospitality, my in-laws were Sunni. They were not Shia. Most Iranians are Shia, but my in-laws were Sunni. And they were very receptive of me as a Christian. And although I got married in a Muslim ceremony, and as part of that ceremony, I had to say the Shahada, I did not say it with the intention of converting to Islam. And my in-laws knew what was, we all agreed on what was happening. And so they were very, very even interested. And my mother-in-law one time asked me, do you know how to pray? And whatever it is you do you know how to pray? And I said, yes, I know how to pray. And she said, oh, that's wonderful. That's wonderful. So in a way, I was the minority, but I was a minority who was well accepted as I was, for who I was. In other words, I know some foreign wives who really were discriminated against within their families. Out on the street was a little different. As a foreign woman, I could stop traffic. I never stopped traffic here, but over there I could stop traffic just crossing the street. And that was during the Shah's era. When the Iranian Revolution began to start, it started really in January of '78, and there began to be more and more of a move towards Islam. Khomeini started to, have more influence. Long story. Anyway, women started to wear the veil more often on the street. One day I just decided I was just going to go to the corner grocery store, and I was wearing a sleeveless dress. It's hot in Iran. I was wearing a sleeveless dress. I thought, I'm just going to the corner store and back, no big deal. So a group of school children, little schoolboys, were coming by, and they started throwing stones at me. Now, fortunately, they were very small stones, small boys with small stones. And I decided the best thing to do was just to keep walking and not react to it. So there was a time when, being foreigner, being Christian, a woman who was an unveiled woman, became, a dangerous thing. I left in the summer of '78 and it was really in the fall that the major demonstrations, things. So I did get out before all of that started to happen. That was really more, I think, political than anything else. So it was a mixed experience, but within my family, I think the lead of my mother and father-in-law of accepting me meant that the whole family, all the, thousands of relatives all did accept me.
And as I hear your story, both familial and communal, and we chatted about this a little bit, the two threads that we're really pulling out today, perseverance and courage, seem to be woven through both in your personal story, but also in the stories of those around you. I imagine, it's an imagination, it's a projection, but I suspect to be true. Your welcome into your in-laws family required courage on your family's part, right? To receive a white Christian woman into their family, not just into the family, but literally into the heart of the family in Tehran, and to allow to visibly expand and change their family identity. I suspect that was an extreme act of courage. but also a courage on your part to join a family that was so distinct from your heritage, a commitment of perseverance to those relationships, again, on both parts.
Yeah.
Similarly, moving into the Order of Saint Helena, I wrote down, that we make a life commitment. For those of us who are married, we make a life commitment as well, but in some ways not quite. I arguably perhaps not as seriously. I was struck by your statement that it's 5 or 6 years into the relationship that only then do we begin to explore a life commitment. And it comes with a really pointed expression that I had never heard before, but it stood out, that we will obey God through the common mind of the community. I may not have gotten it quite right, but
yeah, that's
that, and that both the life commitment requires two remarkable gifts: a commitment of perseverance, to persist in relationship, and the gift of courage, that is to persist in a relationship that is both unknown and imperfect.
Yeah. So I took my life vow in 2005, living in New York. But, we did have a house in Georgia, but I think I would never move to the South. I'd stay in New York. And at the time that I was preparing to take the life vow, I started in my mind to make a list, and I said, okay, I'll do this if I don't have to move to Georgia. And if I don't, I started to put conditions on it. And then I realized I can't put conditions on this. I've got to just, if I'm going to commit to this, I have to just make that commitment to this life, to this order, to these vows. And it was only a few years later that we decided that we were all going to move to the South. And there we are. And we've made it work.
So I wonder, as you think about those particular commitments, a commitment to perseverance in relationship, and a commitment to be courageous in relationship. I mean, your story of your encounter with the contractor years ago, an expression of both perseverance and courage. Courage to voice the conflict, to face it, to address it together, but to persevere in relationship.
Yeah. Right.
That instead of conflict and then walking away, you persevere. I can go on and on. What are the tools that help you persevere with courage in relationship?
Oh my, that's a great question. And I think it has to do with one of the questions, one of the elders of our community, who has since gone to glory, Sister Cornelia, was the superior for many years. And when she was going through a difficult time in community, she went into the chapel to pray. And what came to her was, why did you come? There were two questions. Why did you come to the Order of Saint Helena? What brought you here? And the second question was, why are you still, is it still true? What is keeping you here now? So when we have new members coming to the community and people applying and doing their discernment of whether this life is for them, that's one of the questions I asked, why are you interested in this? Why are you interested in coming? And I said, hold on to that thought, really write it down somewhere. Remember what it was that brought you here. so that when you're having difficulties in the future, you can go back to that and say, oh yes, that's why I'm here. And this is why and there may be other reasons why somebody would stay. But I think remember, what is the goal here? And there are times that we do have we go through difficult things, whether it's an interpersonal conflict or somebody's illness or whatever it is. And having that commitment, and it's a commitment that we make every day. Now, we have stages that you're a postulant for 6 months, and then a novice for 2 years, and then junior vows, and then you get up to life profession. And it's not like you've taken the course and you've got the certificate and it's over. It's a recommitment every morning to get up and to keep going. And I don't mean to sound like drudgery, because those who are called to this life, it is absolutely life-giving. It's absolutely wonderful.
And yet, I mean, I remember our first encounter. You mentioned, and you had a sweetness on your face as you said. Many think of the covenanted or monastic life as one of piety, and you said it much better. There he is.
Yeah, I'm going to learn at the feet of my holy sisters, and I have learned at the feet of my holy sisters. But I've learned a lot else too.
Sure, and I think one of the things we've talked about here at Christ Church over the years is the recognition that community is complex. It has those holy and sacred and profound and joyful experiences. It also has some drudgery and boredom and frustration or anger. It has all of those things, but we don't get the joy, the wisdom, the grace without persevering through the drudgery, the boredom, and having courage in the face of the conflict that comes.